Welcome to the Let It Shine podcast. This is Donna Tipton Howell, your host, and today we're going to talk about the brain. I've been reading quite a few studies on the brain and how things we think, things we say, things we do may affect our brain shaping. In graduate school, I reviewed hundreds of research articles for my master's degree, and there was no internet then. It was a much more daunting task. I realize the importance of verifying studies for validity, but for time's sake, I've skipped over lots of the actual study and moved to the findings, so I don't offer any of this as 100% fact. Yet I believe there are enough consistencies in the findings to be fairly confident in some of the conclusions. So I have a few thoughts from these months of study and review. We've dealt with serious mental illness issues in my own family. My mom could be noted as one of the most difficult cases for both the medical doctors and the mental health doctors. Her anxieties and depressions became actually debilitating in her last several years, and she was not able to really even live a normal life. Some of us also have been dealt with these health issues in our own lives, in my family, to some degree. So for my children and grandchildren, I've been thinking about compiling some findings that might be helpful should they encounter some of these problems in their life. Here are some of the big ideas from my studies. The brain actually continues changing daily. It rewires itself as we act, speak, and even as we think. And habits or patterns are formed as well. If I think or speak negative thoughts consistently, my brain begins to rewire itself to think mostly in this way. If I feed my brain negative thoughts, then that's what it begins to recreate. It is pretty much a cycle of worry and defeat. It is based on fear, and that fear produces more worry and more feelings of defeat and more fear. And this is basically what engineers anxiety. A negative thought or fear gets in your brain and you begin dwelling on it. And you go round and round about the terrible things that might happen. And so your brain continues to produce more negative thoughts. This cycle of worry then leads to anxiety. Now the body then gets involved as well. The stress tells the brain to produce hormones. These hormones impact the body, and they can bring all kinds of pain and sickness. So now you not only have the mental anxieties or depression, but you have a physical pain brought on by all these stress hormones. When you're stressed, your body activates a fight or flight. You remember that from psychology class. And it releases hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Now, these are good in and of themselves. The adrenaline is good if you need to run away from a bear, but if there's no real physical danger, it really has nowhere to go. This can lead to both physical and emotional symptoms. Your heart rate can increase, your blood pressure can go up, it puts strains on your heart, your muscles tense up, you get aches and pains, even muscle spasms. Stress hormones can disrupt digestion, causing stomach aches, dizziness, headaches, nervous twitches, and chronic stress then can weaken the immune system. And now here we go. You get sick easily because your immune system is overloaded and you have trouble recovering. Your body is dealing with too many extra hormones, trying to relieve the stress, and it does not have enough energy left to keep you healthy. On the other hand, positive thinking, finding the good in a situation and focusing on that, wires the brain to continue thinking in a positive way. This does not necessarily come naturally. Perhaps for some it does, but for most, we have to train our brains to be positive. And some findings indicate this is influenced by your genetic makeup as well. So you face some challenge, some problem that needs solving, but you go at it with the attitude that there is a solution and that you will find it. And yes, You do think about it and ponder on it, but you don't focus on the negative. You try and do what you can to remedy the situation, but you don't get into that cycle of worry, fear, and anxiety. And God, of course, tells us to bring it to Him, to trust Him, and leave it with Him. That doesn't mean the problem goes away, but it means we learn ways to deal with it within the framework of our trust in God. Not as easy as it sounds. There's a pretty old book called The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. I went back and read that, and it shared numerous case studies of folks who learned to train their mind to think in a positive way, and it changed their entire outlook, and their physical health began to improve as well. Often, just things in their daily life, their physical circumstances improved. Next idea, how does the brain go about rewiring itself? Well, when you think of plastic, you think of flexible. Plastic's often bendable, moldable. And in terms of brain research, there's something called neuroplasticity. The human brain is very adaptable, but it doesn't naturally know what is good or bad for you. When you repeat an action or a thought, whether positive or negative, the neural pathways in the brain are strengthened to allow it to continue that thought or action, which eventually becomes a habit. Every time you practice a skill, repeat the thought, or behave in a certain way, the neurons involved fire together. These repeated firings make a connection stronger and more efficient, forming brain patterns that shape your next actions, reactions, and even your identity. This is why habits become habits over time. Remember the adage, practice makes perfect? So you learn to play an instrument, you practice, and each time you practice, your brain gets stronger in these pathways. Or learning to tie your shoe. It's very difficult initially, but with practice, you do it without even thinking. The same is true when you engage in either positive or negative thoughts or activities. The brain rewires itself to make it easier to follow these paths. So when the Lord tells us to think on these things that are lovely and pure and good report, since He is the one that made us, He knows what needs to be in our hearts to make us fulfilled. He tells us to do good for everyone, and as we do good deeds, we become more inclined to do more good deeds. But also, neuroplasticity can hardwire our brains into negative patterns and thoughts. You know someone who seems to always be worried and negative and unhappy? Their brain has been trained and then wired to think this way. And so now they can hardly help themselves. Do you know people who take the hardest situations and seem to face it in the most positive way possible? Daily thoughts and actions, even the little ones, are shaping the architecture of your mind in ways that determine how you think, how you feel, how you respond to the world. I saw a quote I like. Think about this. Anxiety rehearses disasters. Faith rehearses promises. Training yourself to be positive is as important as exercising your body. The more you work at it, the easier it gets. Several things feed into this as well. We talked in an earlier podcast about the positive effects of gratitude, and we looked at a study where people were assigned to write letters of thanks and to be grateful, to write down 3 things every day they were grateful for. And we saw how this brought them joy and lifted their spirits. So when God tells us to give thanks to Him, it's not so much that He needs to hear our thanks. He knows that we need to express our gratitude towards Him because feeling thankful is actually good for us. Numerous studies also point out how activities involving music help to lift our spirits and make us more joyful. God instructs us to come together and sing to one another psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. And if you have experienced this, after you start singing, You can go into a service and feel pretty low, but if you put your whole self into the singing with your brothers and sisters in Christ, doesn't it just lift you up and you go away feeling much better? So when you're down and discouraged and despondent, you just can't get up and you don't want to go see people. You want to be by yourself. So you stay home from worship. You're really depriving yourself. You're really feeding yourself the negative, and you are keeping yourself from being lifted up by being with others, by caring for others, by reaching out, by singing, by making melody in your heart to the Lord. The more I study this, the more I see the wisdom in God's plan and His commandments for us. Another thing I've learned is that movement of any kind is crucial when you begin to be depressed or anxious. Sitting around, laying in bed, it's the worst thing you can do. Now, sometimes we're just tired, right? You're worn out, you need to rest. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about when you're almost paralyzed from doing anything because of anxiety or depression. The best thing you could do is get up and do something. Move around, wash the dishes, take a walk. Do something for someone else. That is the best way to get the good hormones pumping out of your brain and to limit those stress hormones that cause physical illness along with anxiety and depression. We used to think that motivation must come before action, but new studies indicate that it often takes action to produce motivation. I've studied it that the body has 50 hormones produced in the body, and it points to the role they play in our moods, our thoughts, and our actions. Just by thinking, a certain change comes in the amount of hormones that are produced. It is a delicate balancing act so that too much of a hormone or not enough can throw everything out of whack. Studies show that 90% of your brain activates with hormones associated with joy when you simply visualize a positive experience. So just meditating on something good actually produces joy. Numerous case studies from successful people indicate that visualizing your goals and dreams often enables you to realize those goals and dreams. Doesn't the Bible say nothing is impossible for those who believe? I personally believe this is referring to your work in the kingdom, but many would testify it has worked in their personal lives as well. Even the way we speak to our own selves in our minds is important. We're not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought, yet it is important to talk positively to ourselves and not degrade our own selves or put ourselves down. This is especially important with children, to teach them to think positively of themselves. It seems to be true that people who are mean to others really don't like themselves. So when you think about those who bully others, they are insecure in their own minds and use this to try and feel better about themselves. But of course, that doesn't work. I'm reminded of the stories of slaves in the cotton fields who would sing as they worked. Some of our most loved songs are from their hope of a promised land beyond this life. So even in the darkest circumstances, they were able to find ways to lift their spirits. The combination of singing and visualization worked wonders. Another big idea is how the brain networks experiences. When I first started studying the brain, it was in regard to children learning to read and children labeled as gifted. Years ago, we learned that the more experiences you give children, the more background knowledge they have when they start to learn to read and learn. So parents who provide experiences for their little ones, they say something like, look, this is a tree, this is a bird, the bird sings, look, this is a ladybug, it has spots. And the more experiences children have early on before they go to school, the more likely they are to read well and to be successful in school. This is because with each new experience, the brain map just starts shooting out new paths. If you could watch it, you would just see these neuron paths just connecting all the experiences. Oh, there's a bird. I connect a bird with wings, and then I connect a bird with singing, and I connect a bird with flying. And all of these paths just start crossing and building, and this child has a wonderful network in the brain before even going to school. He now is ready. He has so much background knowledge, and he will end up being able to move quickly through studies. Did you know that 80 to 90% of the brain growth takes place in the first 3 years of life? This rapid development is influenced by nutrition, a feeling of safety, responsive interactions, and an absence of toxic stress. So now we see why some start with such a disadvantage, which is such a shame. Experiences and care during this sensitive period are so very important to the brain's high plasticity, and poor conditions can lead to irreversible developmental impacts that affect future learning, problem solving, and all-around success. Without this healthy brain development, children have difficulty in every area of learning. Stress in children is just as damaging as in adults. The Bible says to train up a child in the way he should go, and he will not depart from it. So training the child is another way to say you rewire the brain to do what is right. We've talked about the hormone that stress produces called cortisol in the brain, and it comes from negative thinking. When the brain encounters emotions like anger and hate and bitterness, it actually shrinks part of the brain and just keeps it from learning and from growing. And think about what the Lord tells us: to love one another, to love your enemies, to pray for those who use you and treat you badly. You think that we're really sacrificing something for the Lord when we're doing that? Well, actually, we are doing what's good for our own selves, what's good for our brains, what's good for our stress, and what's good for our health. Listening to God and His will for us, and even His commandments for us, are for our good. It's not to make us miserable, just to make us completely healthy, thriving, happy citizens who can contribute to their community, citizens in the kingdom who can lead others to Christ. And finally, it seems to be those who have learned to enjoy the little things are the ones with lots of happiness. Here's a quote from Andy Rooney. For most of life, nothing wonderful happens. If you don't enjoy getting up and working and finishing your work and sitting down to a meal with family and friends, then the chances are that you're not going to be very happy. If someone bases his happiness or unhappiness on major events like a great new job, huge amounts of money, a flawlessly happy marriage, a trip to Paris, that person isn't going to be happy much of the time. If, on the other hand, happiness depends on a good breakfast, flowers in the yard, a drink, or a nap, then we are more likely to live with quite a bit of happiness. I love that quote. Only deity could form such an amazing and complex creature as us. We are created in His image, but we do have a free will. Let's let Him be the potter, and we will let Him shape us into the image of His Son. This whole complex life is our testing ground. Shape us, test us, Lord. Put us through the fire. It won't be easy, but we will study, and we will pray, and we will lift one another up. And when we were down, we'll get up again and try again. Thanks, everyone, for considering all these ideas. Hope you have a great day.